Just good morning, everyone. I'm Geri Katz. I'm one of your M&A staff, and I'm so excited to introduce you to Professor Peter Rachleff, who is the co-executive director of the Eastside Freedom Library and professor of history at Macalester College. We are so lucky to have him here. He has focused on urban studies, African American studies, North American studies, women's studies, labor studies. He is a Renaissance man of interesting and important history that is, I think, going to be very instructive for what we're going through today. So, with that, I will turn that over to you, Professor Rachleff.
Thank you, Geri. I don't know what your usual ground rules are, but I'm happy for people to unmute and speak at any time to ask questions or make comments. So what I shared with you, a little piece that I wrote and wanted to have you, as I suggested, to think with me about how to make sense of complex working class history dynamics that reveal both the possibilities of solidarity and the challenges to solidarity. So one of the things that we try to center here at the Eastside Freedom Library is the idea that the past and the present are in an ongoing conversation with each other. And it's dynamic on both ends. Sometimes what we experience in the present leads us to ask different questions of the past, and we might discover new things. And likewise, in our digging into the past, we may discover lessons is perhaps too strong a word, but at least suggestions about how we might at least better understand our present and perhaps find some strategies and tactics that we might use. So coming at it from the perspective of the past, I fell into the project of researching the working class history of Richmond, Virginia in the aftermath of the Civil War. Because early in my graduate school training, I read a book called Industrial Slavery in the Old South by a guy named Robert Starobin. And in that book, Starobin demonstrates that there were more enslaved people, both men and women, working in factories in Richmond, Virginia, than anywhere else in the South. Typically, I, like many of us, had thought of slavery as a predominantly agricultural system. Wendy's asking how to spell the author's name. It's S-T-A-R-O-B-I-N, Robert Starobin, Industrial Slavery in the Old South. And Starobin was not trying to say that slavery was central to industrialization in the United States, but really showing that slavery was a more flexible system than we had thought about. And it led me to be interested in what were the intersections between slave labor and so-called free labor, and particularly how to explore that by investigating what happened after emancipation. There were about 4,000 enslaved African Americans who worked in factories in Richmond, and I was curious about whether they had kept their jobs. Did they organize unions themselves? Did they organize unions together with white workers in the same industries? What was the story of free Black labor in Richmond, which of course had been the capital of the Confederacy? What was the story of free Black labor? and what were the possibilities of solidarity between white workers and African-American workers. And I was drawn to that subject to back up even a tad further. I had grown up in the 1950s and 60s in New London, Connecticut, a city that was small, 35,000 people. There was one high school. So we all from across the city went to the same high school and junior high school together. But it was a city that had been shaped by the US Navy, the military, and by a major employer, General Dynamics Electric Boat, that built submarines. And as a result, New London had been a magnet for African-American and Puerto Rican and Filipino immigrants. And so when I went to high school in the later 1960s, many of my fellow students were students of color, and many of them were inspired by what was going on in the civil rights movement. And so issues of racism and racial justice were really central in my high school years. And I carried those concerns to college, and I carried those concerns to my graduate study in labor history at the University of Pittsburgh. So that was what brought me to Richmond, and to try to figure out what happened after emancipation. And what I discovered was initially emancipation was more of a gradual transition than flipping a light switch, that there were many ways that the system of slavery itself had been flexible. Slaves were enabled to earn piecework bonuses, to earn money for themselves. The property was too expensive in the city for those who employed slaves to provide them with housing. So often enslaved men and women were given board money and told to go find your own place to live. So I discovered that in the 1840s and 1850s, slavery in Richmond had been more flexible than we might have imagined. And I discovered, as I think is no longer surprising to anyone, that so-called free labor had an awful lot of restrictions on it, and being free didn't feel so free in the later 1860s and 1870s. So the initial question I started with proved to be one that I could answer in about 10 minutes, and was not going to give itself to a major research project. But then I stumbled across something that blew my mind. That in 1886, a labor organization called the Noble and Holy Order of the Knights of Labor, that this labor organization had organized a third party outside of both the Republicans and the Democrats, and that third party had contested for the Richmond City Council, and that they had swept to control of the City Council with a slate of candidates who were African American as well as whites, and a base that was African American as well as white. 21 years after the end of the Civil War in the former capital of the Confederacy. And I have to say, I don't remember if I shouted in the archives, "Holy shit," but it was definitely a holy shit moment. And my research, and really the next 5 or 6 years of my life, and then the ensuing almost 40 years, has been trying to understand how that happened, how that was possible. And at the same time, I discovered that this success lasted for a hot minute, lasted for maybe 6 months. And then that biracial solidarity, working class coalition fell apart. And I found myself with this really challenging intellectual question: how to explain how something was possible but also to explain how it fell apart. And that's what I want to try to think through with you this morning. Last point, and again about this idea of a conversation between the past and the present. We have been living through now 4 months since the murder of George Floyd, 6 months since the beginning of the pandemic. And it has generated all kinds of impressive, inspiring, grassroots, organizing movements, protests, energy. And one of those pieces has been challenging monuments. Who do we make monuments to? If you noticed in the last month, there's been the very interesting development in Central Park in New York that finally there was a monument to the women who fought for the women's suffrage amendment, which was successfully passed 100 years ago in August. But there was a struggle about the initial plan for the monument included only 2 white women. And there was great grassroots pressure to reconsider and reconfigure that monument to include the presence of a Black woman, which is what indeed happened. But I was interested that one of the monuments that has really been a flashpoint of protest was a monument to the Confederate General Robert E. Lee in the city of Richmond, Virginia. And that I thought that too many people were too easily saying that this was a bad monument because Robert E. Lee was a leader of the Confederates. We should not have monuments to the Confederacy. Therefore, it should come down. And I knew that while the Confederacy was shut down in 1865, the monument to Robert E. Lee was not constructed until 1890. And I think a good historian or someone who's traveling through history always wants to ask, what else is going on when something is happening? What is its context? And so I wanted to raise the question, what was going on in 1890 that led to the investment of lots of money, lots of time and energy and political capital in building this, frankly, monstrosity of a statue on a 50-foot high base. Ironically, the statue was actually made in France and shipped by boat to the United States in parts. And then there was a whole public rigmarole of schlepping the parts to where they were going to reassemble them as the monument. And I always love saying that rebuilding the labor movement is a labor-intensive process, and that's a good thing. The more people that have to be involved, the more people take ownership and become part of what's created. And the Robert E. Lee statue was very strategically put together so that thousands of people, all of them white, were involved in reassembling and celebrating this monstrous statue. So I wanted to jump in and say, let's use this statue as a kind of cipher to talk about what's going on in Richmond in 1890, not what was the Civil War about or the Confederacy, but why 1890. And let me just say as an aside that something that I only recently learned, and I have humility about how much I don't know and how much we all continue to learn when we keep digging. I only recently learned from Martha Jones, who has just published a brilliant book called Vanguard, how Black women broke barriers, gained the right to vote, and insisted on equality for all. Martha shared with me, and in her book tells the story that in 1922, 3 years after the passage of the 19th Amendment, in 1922, a group of Southern senators proposed that the United States government fund a statue to be built at the US Capitol in the Rotunda, a statue which would honor Mammy for Mammy's dedication to caring for the white children of the South. And it's somewhat refreshing to me that sometimes I tell this story lately and people say, who was Mammy? And I think, thank goodness you don't even, it's not even in your, memory or imagination to have to wrestle with. Those of us who saw Gone with the Wind at some time in our lives, or have done, we watched the wonderful Jewish singer Al Jolson and his popular song, Mammy, How I Love You, Mammy. And I think, what the hell did this Jewish guy know about white-black relationships during slavery? Tells it how deep this shit really goes. But Martha explained that there was actually an attempt, and the point of the statue was to blunt the efforts of African American women to claim the right to vote. That yes, the 19th Amendment was ratified, but there was pushback. And the pushback was, as some of the academics I've been around would say, the pushback operated on a symbolic level as well as a political level. And so it wasn't only about continuing to use poll taxes and grandfather clauses and ask people to interpret some obscure paragraph from the Constitution, but it was also to create a narrative that said, Black women don't need the right to vote. Black women's political needs have been manifested through the white children that they raised, who suckled at their breasts and grew up to love them and would never harm them. And fortunately, that statue was never built. And Martha tells the story. This is a great little story for us here in Minnesota. Martha tells the story that an organization called the National Council of Negro Women organized and resisted and succeeded. The leader of that fight was Hallie Q. Brown. And here in the Twin Cities, we know that Penumbra Theater lives in the Hallie Q. Brown Center in the Rondo neighborhood of St. Paul. Many of us have been in and out of that building and have not asked the question, so who was Hallie Q. Brown? Why is this building named after her? And Hallie Q. Brown led the fight against the Mammy statue. So all of that was bubbling around for me when I came back to the question of the Robert E. Lee statue and why it had been built. And as I did a little more digging, 40 years after I had written my doctoral dissertation, or 39 years, I discovered that it was part of a symbolic offensive to bring white workers back under the umbrella of white supremacy and to turn them away from the alliance that they had built with African Americans, expressed in 1886 in the Working Men's Reform Party that persisted for some time, not a long time, in Richmond. And I think that part of what I also discovered was that the leaders of the Republican Party, which was the supposedly anti-racist party, the party of Lincoln, the leaders of the Republican Party worked just as hard to drive a wedge between African American workers and white workers from one direction as the leaders of the Democratic Party, which was the party of the so-called wave the bloody shirt, remember the honor of the Confederacy, that both the leaders, and I'm not sure that they were ever in the same smoke-filled back room together and said, let's conspire together to do this. But the consequences of their actions moved in the same direction. A decade later, there would be a constitutional convention in Virginia, which would take the right to vote away from African Americans altogether. So that was a way to for sure shut the door on a biracial political coalition. Let's just erase African Americans from the political landscape. And that persisted into the 1960s and the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So again, the intellectual challenge for me was to try to understand how was biracial labor solidarity possible and why did it remain fragile? I don't want to do all the talking, and I would love to hear thoughts, questions from you to see where we should go. I mean, I'm happy to tell more stories, but I'm really interested in what you might be thinking and how this is relevant to what we're all facing today and what nurses and the Minnesota Nurses Association in particular is facing today. Who dares to start? Come on now. Okay, then I'm gonna raise the ante, and at the risk of moving into unpleasant territory and see. So part of the Richmond story, and I think part of how we try to understand divisions between African Americans and whites, or divisions between immigrants and native born, is that we really need to think spatially about division this way, but also division this way, hierarchically. It's not just that people might live in different neighborhoods and work in different jobs, but also that class in the United States is a complicated phenomenon with multiple layers, and not just either you're part of the 1% or you're part of the 99%. That 99% is striated in many ways that make solidarity difficult. So shortly after the pandemic began, I was teaching a working class history by Zoom through the New Brookwood Labor College. And I don't know if that's on your radar. I urge you to become aware of the New Brookwood Labor College and the different classes that they and we are making available. Kate Shaughnessy has been teaching a really interesting class this fall called Pandemics and Politics, and looking at, I love it because it's historical, looking at other pandemics in American history and asking, how did the labor movement, how was it impacted, how did it respond? Please look at the New Brookwood Labor College. So I was teaching and also sort of stumbling through my way of how the hell do you teach on Zoom, and fortunately I had actually a former student of mine, Caitlin Reed, who is now a staff person at MAPE. Caitlin was a pre-K teacher for many years and on the executive board of the St. Paul Teachers Federation of Educators. And Caitlin knew how to do stuff like I think Geri knows how to do, like how to share the screen and stuff that I find challenging. And so we were showing, we had learned that you can't ask people to read a whole hell of a lot if they're still working. And so we would show a movie and then have a conversation about the movie. And I showed a movie, actually, interestingly, a movie that we're actually going to screen tonight through our Facebook and YouTube pages, called The River Ran Red. And it's a movie about the Homestead Steel Strike of 1892. I love the movie and I love the story in part because the primary bad guy was Andrew Carnegie. It was the Carnegie Steel Works in Homestead, Pennsylvania, and the East Side Freedom Library is squatting in a Carnegie library. And so I always use the presence of Mr. Carnegie as a teaching tool. And I like to think that maybe he turns over in his grave every time I get a chance to mention him. So I'm showing this movie. We're going to show it tonight as part of our monthly labor history film series. And a lion's share of the students in the New Brookwood class were staffers from SEIU Healthcare Minnesota. And the core of the Homestead Steel Strike story is how did the skilled workers, and they had, the skilled jobs had really cool names like puddlers, roughers, rollers, catchers. And they were, of course, the small group in the mill. And then the large group in the mill are unskilled workers who might be sent to do one thing on Monday and something else on Tuesday and be sent home on Wednesday and not know if they're going to have a job on Thursday. And how did those workers organize together? Compounded by the fact that most of the highly skilled workers were of Irish, German, Welsh, British, or American-born backgrounds, and most of the unskilled workers were Slovak, Hungarian, Polish, Serbian, Slovenian. How did they come together? So I'm showing this movie and we're going to have this conversation about it. And one of the SEIU healthcare staffers says, well, that sounds like the relationship between RNs and housekeepers, nursing assistants, LPNs in our contemporary hospitals. So let me throw that back at you. Surely you have some experience and probably some opinions about, is that an unfair characterization? Is that a challenge? It's not your fault that that's the challenge. I love to say that that I understand Marx's conception of history to be, history deals us a hand of cards. We can't control what cards were dealt, but we can control how we choose to play those cards. And so, is that an accurate depiction of the cards that history has dealt you as RNs? And how are you choosing as individuals and as union members to play those cards? And I have to say, Michael, your dogs keep walking back and forth. I'm glad to see them. Dogs are good. Okay, come on, somebody. What do you think?
Hi, I'm Emily. I work at Abbott Northwestern, which is a very diverse workplace in Minneapolis here. And yeah, it strikes me on a daily basis how so many of our housekeepers and nursing assistants and transport aides are immigrants, people of color. I mean, I guess I don't really, I do notice it on a regular basis. And I mean, on our unit, we actually have a break room where the housekeepers tend to congregate. And I don't know if it's because our unit tends to be pretty open and welcoming, but that's just the way it is. We're on the 5th floor, we're on H 5200. And it's challenging, and I definitely wonder about it a lot, especially now. The one interesting thing is we do have many African immigrant registered nurses. So there's this slight difference with, we've got Ethiopian, Liberian, we've got many people of African descent who are registered nurses. And so it's like they have a different sense of empowerment. And yeah, I definitely notice it. I don't really have anything super profound, I guess, to share about it, but it's totally on my radar. I
have to step away and answer the door.
Emily, please keep going.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess especially during the pandemic, since George Floyd, given the location of Abbott Northwestern, it's definitely been, I've been mindful of all these things, but especially even more so now. And yeah, I guess I don't really, like I said, I don't have anything super profound to share. But
that's a great start. Yeah.
I felt compelled to just at least start us off because this is super important. I feel like in our extremely diverse workplace, we're super fortunate. We could potentially, help foster change. It's my husband works at the University of Minnesota, and it's very different. He does not have the diversity that we have at the hospital. So I just feel like this is a very important topic, and we need to continue to become more enlightened about, the past, our history, and, figure out where we're going. Because we also see it in our patients, our patients with COVID. I mean, hands down, I mean, it's unbelievable, the racial disparities, for sure. One patient was, I think he was from somewhere in Latin America, and his whole family, who's mostly in New York, they all have had COVID. So I don't know. I just feel like this is a very important topic for all of us, especially as nurses, because we live it and see it, and we're right in the thick of it to help promote some type of change somehow.
Yeah.
Thank you, Emily.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. I'm Michael. I work just across the street from you up at Children's. I think this question of our relationship, the relationship between M&A and SEIU is crucial one, because it is where we see the intersection of different class striations, right? Because as nurses in Minnesota, we're some of the highest paid nurses in the world, right? We are high up on those levels of striation economically. the diversity of Minnesota is not well reflected in our ranks. So it's where but it is reflected in the ranks of SEIU. And so when we talk about trying to build solidarity with SEIU, people we work with shoulder to shoulder, day after day, there's huge potential for solidarity building and for a great opportunity to work through some of these issues of class and race. I would love to have more examples of how people have done that. Because the obstacles are mighty, right? I mean, we not only have to find ways to bridge racial gaps, but also significant economic gaps. And I don't know how we do that and bring the rest of our union along, right? Because we're very diverse in our political views in the MNA. And I don't know, those are just questions I have.
Thank you, Michael.
Hi, this is Jeanne Surdo, and I wanted to share the fact that, you know, I see it in my everyday work, but I see it in a lot of different striations. I mean, let's face it, Emily, you were just talking about the COVID thing. It's like, you know, it's the nurses going back in and working, but all of the, let me think, all of the housekeepers and everybody else that are out there working all the time. It's the people that were still working in your grocery stores, and that diverse group. And I'll say I have a different point of view because I grew up on the East Coast, not far from where Peter Rachleff is from, but on Long Island, actually. But we had a large Black population that was in our high school. We had, but they were not diverse in where they lived. So it was interesting, or it was an interesting piece for me to kind of grasp around that. And when I was at Metro State, you know, a long time ago, they actually had a class. It was, I think it was an English writing class or something, but it was American history at the movies. And we had to watch so many of the different movies and talk about how, you know, the movies and life reflect each other. And then sometimes they are so far away. Thank you.
Hi, this
Thanks,
is Lisa.
Jean. Yes.
Michael, what you said about the not having diversity within nursing, it started, I don't know if any of you have been to the Florence Nightingale Museum in London. It started then. There was a woman who applied to go with Florence to the Crimean Wars, and she had the skills, but she was denied because she was a Negro. And I think that's reflected in nursing still to this day. When you look at the numbers of the diversity, but also in who's in administration, who's, you know, active within the unions, who's making the decisions, there's not a lot of reflection of diversity. And it's interesting when you said, Peter, about the history, to look back at history and see that the length of the foundation of it is pretty daunting.
But there are examples of people transcending, sort of to go back to my metaphor, people playing the cards that have been dealt to them in ways that have built solidarity. Unfortunately, those examples have tended not to last in the long run, but they do suggest to me, actually, I'll tell you one other little story. When I first started to publish my research, I presented a paper at a conference in Madison, Wisconsin, and this really crusty guy named Herbert Hill, who those of us in the labor history, labor union world would refer to Herbert Hill as the Jewish black nationalist. And Herbert Hill had spent 40 years in the job of being the labor secretary for the NAACP. And I realized as I came to try to understand this guy, that what he had spent 40 years of his life doing was reading letters. This was largely before email. Reading letters from African-American workers with horrible stories about how badly they had been abused, either by their manager or foreman, or in some cases, how badly they had been abused by the union in their workplace. And so it got to him, which is not surprising. And when I gave my presentation, he said, you know, you give as much evidence that black and white workers could not organize together as you do that they could. And I said, if you will grant the possibility that they could organize together, we're already going in the right direction, that it's possible. I want to just pick up on Emily's story from Abbott about the break rooms. And my conclusion in my book was that what had made solidarity possible was that the leaders of the African-American community and the white leaders of the labor movement had come together and had worked out an alliance and had worked out a strategy, you know, and I think, as you might imagine, that involves some, you're going to get this reward, your members are going to get that reward, you know, here's how we're going to divide up the so-called spoils, and we'll work together. And then each of us will go out to our respective constituencies and advocate for how people should behave. And that worked for about 2 years. The problem, I concluded, was that at the grassroots level, African Americans and white workers continued not to work together, not to live in the same neighborhood with each other, not to worship in the same churches, not to socialize in the same places. And so when other powerful people came on the scene and sort of whispered in their ears, don't trust those other people. They're working with you right now, but when they get a chance to stick a knife in your back, they will. And that they fell for those narratives coming from other powerful people because they had not formed experiences in their own lives that enabled them to, what we're really trying to do here at the Eastside Freedom Library. It had not enabled them to understand that the experiences of Oromo immigrants are not very different from what the experiences of Russian Jewish immigrants had been. That the experiences of Salvadoran immigrants are not very different from what the experiences of Irish immigrants had been. That if we can be in the same space and feel safe and comfortable to tell our stories, we discover how much we have in common. So while I think it's important that the leaders of the MNA and the leaders of SEIU Healthcare Minnesota not only occupy neighboring spaces for offices, but actually talk together and plot and scheme together. It's really important what happens in your break rooms at Abbott or other places. Can those of us who believe in the value of interracial solidarity create little projects that enhance the kinds of conversations that people might have? I love food. So I'm a big fan of, let's try each other's food. Let's have some samosas in the break room. You know, it's sukkahs. You know, what Jewish food could we bring into the break room? What soul food could we bring into? How can we encourage people? Potluck is a great thing. And because all food has stories. And I do these, not lately, but I was doing these walking tours of the history of immigration on the East Side, starting in Sweet Hollow, and walking up Payne Avenue. And as I've done the research on Payne Avenue, to discover how virtually every immigrant group that came, beginning with the Swedes and the Irish, and now with the Karen and Oromo and Hmong, that they all have grocery stores because people want to eat comfort food. And so let's share each other's comfort foods. Are there holidays that we might celebrate together? Learn more about the history of a holiday. What about birthdays? I've learned from AFSCME Local 3800 at the University of Minnesota, where they had to organize clerical workers who were spread until you get a chance to pick it at the University of Minnesota, which they gave us a couple of times over the years. You don't realize how enormous the physical plant is. And so how does the administrative assistant in the history department in the social science tower, you know, how does she come to know other administrative assistants in other departments or in other buildings? So that they used birthday parties as a way to build those opportunities for people to share their stories with each other. So, you know, how can you build grassroots solidarity? And then, you know, what the SEIU staffers also had to say was that sometimes their members felt disrespected in the work itself by how they were being treated by an RN, or, you know, as we would hear from many, how they were treated by a doctor, you know, who thought that he was God. So, you know, maybe we don't start with the rough spots. We don't start with how do we tackle hierarchy and how do we tackle work related, but how do we tackle the fact that we're working in the same place and that we all have families and that we all have stories and that we all love certain foods? Or how do we build those? How do we use those to build relationships so that we can begin to trust each other? And I think that's what did not happen in Richmond, sadly. And now history is told in Richmond, as I used the word erase before, to even erase the possibility that that could have happened. No one knows. I'm a big fan of going around to places and saying, so where's the plaque that tells the story? Here on the East Side, there's a viaduct, a little bridge that goes over the railroad tracks. In April of 1894, railroad workers who were on strike came out of union meetings 3 blocks up Payne Avenue and dumped garbage from that viaduct onto the railroad tracks to block scab trains that were being run from Minneapolis to Duluth. I love telling the story, and then I say, so where's the plaque? Where's the plaque at 896 Payne Avenue where they had those meetings? The same building is still there. And I said, where is the plaque on the Richmond City Hall that was built because of the labor movement and because of interracial solidarity in the labor movement? There's no plaque. Go to the Wikipedia page for the City Hall, and it only talks about the architect. Doesn't talk about who actually built it. And so we have to create these stories. And I think that one of the things that history can do is gives us a mirror to look in which our best self appears in that mirror. How do we bring our best selves into relationships with each other? I wonder, Emily, about the African nurses at Abbott. There was a time, I don't know, oh, I know, it was a great little series of events. I got involved with Jewish Community Action around this situation in a town called Postville, Iowa, in 2008, and where there had been a raid by immigration authorities. And this sort of supreme irony, I think, that this was the largest kosher meat processing plant in the United States. And 400 of the workers in this plant were undocumented indigenous immigrants from Guatemala. And immigration authorities raided the plant, arrested 398 workers, and imprisoned them in the Waterloo Cattle Grounds, which is like the Minnesota Fairgrounds. And Jewish Community Action rose up and to try to organize around, oh my God, the rules of kosher only talk about how the animals are treated and not how the workers are treated. And there were huge debates in the Jewish community between Orthodox rabbis and Reform rabbis and congregants from different parts. I mean, there were all of these divisions, and it was a huge kind of undertaking in which people in the Jewish community took a really good look at themselves. And unfortunately, here we are 12 years later, the rules of what's kosher still do not include how are workers treated. But it's not a failure. I mean, it's left this experience with people. And in the midst of all of that, we met a group of Africans, we being Jewish Community Action at the time, who had developed a project to get professionals who had immigrated, who had degrees from universities and training programs in Africa, lawyers, doctors, nurses, professors, whose degrees did not have currency in the United States. And they were negotiating with the University of Minnesota how to get people on a fast track to get the appropriate certification so that they could be professionals again. So I'm very curious about those African nurses at Abbott. Did they have to go through a retraining process to get the certification? What kind of, what does it take to go back to school? Not only to be an immigrant in a strange place, but to have to back up in terms of your own life cycle and stages, and be very interested to know more about them. Again, I'm talking too much. Let's hear from somebody else.
So Peter, I wanted to mention one thing that M&A has done, and I don't know if all of the members in this class are aware or not, but the Minnesota Nurses Association Foundation recognized the issue a couple of years ago about the lack of diversity in the nursing profession, and started to think about what are the barriers for people of color and Indigenous people to become registered nurses. And very often it's financial. Nursing school is very expensive. And so they, 2 years ago, created a new scholarship called the Mary Eliza Mahoney Scholarship. And Mary Eliza Mahoney was the United States' first African-American graduate nurse. And this is available. It's a